This is Atlas, broadcasting to you from the graveyard. Survivors, if you're hearing this, you've tuned into the one place where the world still feels connected, even if it's just through this voice. Right now, it's 2:47 in the morning, and the night still carries that strange, sharp chill that feels like it's trying to seep under your skin. 2 weeks. That's how long it's been since my last broadcast. 2 weeks of walking through this ever-shifting landscape, searching for answers, and finding only more questions. But you're still out there. You're still listening. And if there's one thing that matters, it's that. Whatever the world has become, we haven't disappeared into it. Not completely. There's a lot to unpack tonight, survivors. The ground beneath us, the air around us, even the infected. It's all changing faster than we can map it. The rules we used to live by are being rewritten, and it feels like every step forward comes with 2 steps into the unknown. Let's not waste time. The things I've seen over the past few days aren't the kind of mysteries you can ignore, no matter how much you'd like to. First, let's talk about what I came across just outside the old industrial zone. It's the kind of place you'd think would be stripped bare by now, picked clean by anyone desperate enough to risk its collapsing walls and stagnant air. But as I approached, there was something off. The vehicles, dozens of them arranged almost methodically, overturned, hoods open, doors ajar. It wasn't random chaos. It felt staged, deliberate, as if someone or something wanted them to look that way. And then there was the sound, clicking, faint at first, but unmistakable as I got closer. It wasn't mechanical, not exactly. It was too rhythmic, too intentional. I can't tell you what's making it, but whatever it is, it's not something you want to meet unprepared. I stayed on the edges, observing, and every instinct screamed at me to keep moving. If you come across something like this, listen to that instinct. Trust it. The moment something feels wrong, it usually is, but the vehicles weren't the only thing I found on that trip. There's something new forming out there, something that shouldn't exist. Pools of black liquid, thicker than water, too reflective to be oil. They're spreading in places where the infected seem to linger, and they're not just sitting there passively. They ripple, not from the wind, not from anything touching them, but as if they're alive, responding to your presence. I didn't test it. I didn't want to find out what happens if you do. If you see it, mark the area and move on. And then there's the infected themselves. They're changing again, slower, quieter, but more dangerous than ever. I saw them moving in pairs, hiding behind debris like hunters stalking prey, not stumbling into traps anymore, but avoiding them, calculating. I watched as one crouched behind a crumbling barricade, its head tilting just enough to track movement in the distance. It didn't charge. It waited, and then it moved with a purpose that chilled me more than any shambler ever could. Survivors, if you think speed is your only concern, think again. The infected are learning, and so should we. I'll get into more details about that later, but for now, I want to mention something else I've noticed. The nights have grown colder. Not the kind of cold you'd expect as the seasons change. This is different. Sudden drops in temperature that seem to come out of nowhere, leaving frost in places it shouldn't be. I woke up one morning to find the ground around me frozen solid, though the air had been warm the night before. Survivors, if you feel the temperature shift like that, if frost creeps where it has no business being, pay attention. The areas where this is happening are often marked by something else. A hum, that low, rhythmic pulse we've talked about before, the one you feel in your chest more than you hear it. Everywhere I've gone, the signs are the same. The world isn't just changing, it's reacting. To what, I don't know, but these changes, these patterns, they're not random. Survivors have been sending in reports, piecing together fragments of a larger picture. Strange symbols burned into the ground near abandoned camps, silent zones where even the air feels muted. And now this frost, creeping like an invisible tide. If it's part of the infection, it's spreading far beyond what we've ever seen before. And yet, even in the midst of all this, there's still hope to be found. 2 weeks ago, I passed a group of survivors setting up at an old truck stop. They'd fortified the building, marking it with an orange tarp visible from miles away. They were organized, prepared, and willing to trade. If you're near mile marker 140, they're out there, It's not a guarantee, but it's a glimmer of something we all need right now. The reminder that we're not alone in this. This broadcast isn't just a collection of warnings, survivors. It's a lifeline. It's a map of the things I've seen, the places I've been, and the dangers I've barely avoided. So keep listening. Stay sharp. We're just getting started. Survivors, there's something unsettling about the way this world is reshaping itself. Not just in the broad strokes like the infected or the shifting landmarks, but in the small, insidious details that seem to slip past until it's too late. The fields of overturned vehicles I mentioned earlier are a prime example. At first glance, they might seem like the remnants of chaos, the detritus of a panicked world left to rot. But they're more than that. They're deliberate, arranged, and that's what makes them dangerous. Picture this: a stretch of open road, littered with cars that have all been flipped onto their sides or backs. Their hoods are open, their doors too, creating a chaotic symmetry that doesn't feel random. The arrangement is almost too perfect, like pieces placed on a chessboard by a careful hand. You'd think scavengers might have stripped them bare, but no, many of the vehicles still have things inside, tantalizing scraps that might lure you closer. That's the trap. And then there's the sound. The first time I heard it, I thought it might be machinery, a generator running somewhere nearby, maybe. But the clicking was too steady, too rhythmic, like a metronome keeping a beat. I've walked past plenty of abandoned vehicles, and none of them ever made sounds like this. The clicks weren't loud, but they were persistent, coming from different spots among the wreckage. They seemed to echo, making it hard to tell where they were coming from, and harder still to resist the urge to investigate. But here's the thing: I didn't investigate. I trusted my gut, that nagging sense of wrongness that has saved my life more times than I can count. I kept to the edges of the field, moving quietly, carefully, and watching for any signs of movement. Nothing, not even the usual shuffle of infected. It was like the whole area had been abandoned except for the clicking. And as I moved further away, the sound faded, like it was retreating into the silence, waiting for its next target. It's not just the vehicles, either. Survivors have reported similar setups in other places. Collapsed buildings with paths cleared just wide enough to funnel people inside. Alleys littered with scattered supplies that seem too conveniently placed. It's as if someone or something is studying us, learning how we think, and using that knowledge against us. I've heard stories of survivors following trails of canned food into basements, only to find the exits blocked behind them. Sometimes it's infected, sometimes it's worse. The question that keeps me awake at night is who or what is setting these traps. Is it survivors, desperate enough to turn on each other in the name of survival? Or is it something else entirely? The infected are changing, adapting, and if they've developed the capacity to bait us, to lure us into places we can't escape, then we're dealing with a threat far more intelligent than we ever anticipated. I don't have answers, survivors, but I can tell you this: when something feels off, it usually is. Pay attention to the details. If a place looks too convenient, too easy, trust your instincts and walk away. It's better to leave empty-handed than to walk into a trap you can't get out of. And if you hear that clicking sound, the one I described, don't ignore it. Mark the area if you can, warn others if you're able, but don't stay. Whatever is making that noise, it's not friendly. There's a bigger picture here: survivors, one that's starting to come into focus in the worst possible way. These traps, these setups, they're not just about scavenging supplies or taking territory. They're about control, manipulation. Something somewhere is pulling the strings, and the more we fall into their patterns, the tighter those strings become. I wish I could tell you more, give you some kind of clarity in all this confusion, but right now, all I have are the same fragments you do. The clicking, the traps, the eerie precision of it all. It's a puzzle we're still trying to piece together, and time isn't on our side. So stay sharp, stay alert, and trust your instincts. The world has changed, and so must we. Survivors, let's move on to something that's been gnawing at the edges of my thoughts ever since I first saw it. I came across it in the heart of what used to be a bustling urban area, but it could show up anywhere. Pools of liquid, black as the void, thicker than anything natural, and shimmering like polished obsidian under even the faintest light. It's not oil, it's not water, and it's certainly not something you want to touch. These pools aren't large, maybe 3 or 4 feet across, but there's something about them that feels deliberate. They form in places where the world already seems wrong. Cracked intersections, alleyways that seem to lead nowhere, or at the base of decaying buildings that shouldn't still be standing. They look like they shouldn't exist, like the land itself has been scarred and is bleeding something we can't understand. When I saw the first one, I didn't go near it. I didn't have to. As soon as I stepped within 10 feet, the air seemed to change. It felt heavier, as if it were pressing against me, trying to push me back. And then the liquid rippled. Not from a breeze, not from anything falling into it, but on its own. The ripples moved outward, smooth and slow, like the surface of a lake disturbed by something deep beneath it. But there was no beneath to these pools. They weren't connected to anything, at least nothing I could see. I stayed just long enough to watch, to try to understand. The ripples didn't fade the way they should have. They kept going, like they were feeding off the air around them. And then, after a few seconds, they stopped. Completely. The surface went still, like glass, reflecting everything around it with a clarity that felt unnatural. My instincts screamed at me to leave, and I didn't argue. Since then, I've heard stories from other survivors who've seen the same thing. One man described finding a pool near a collapsed theater. He said he saw his reflection in it at first, but as he got closer, the reflection shifted. It wasn't him anymore. It was something else, something taller, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. He ran, and he swore he could feel something watching him long after he was gone. Another survivor, a scavenger working the outskirts of a ruined shopping center, told me about stepping too close to one of these pools. He said the air around it felt alive, almost like it was vibrating. And then, as he leaned in to get a better look, the liquid rose. Just a fraction of an inch, but enough to send him scrambling backward. He said it looked like it was reaching for him, like it wanted to pull him in. He hasn't gone back since. And then there are the infected. They seem drawn to these pools, but not in the way you'd expect. I watched a group of them stumble into a small square where one of these anomalies had formed. They didn't lunge for it, didn't attack it. They stopped, stood perfectly still around it, forming a loose circle as if waiting for something. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, and after a few minutes, they simply walked away. I don't know what it means, but I can tell you this: whatever's happening, these pools are tied to it. Theories are starting to surface, but none of them bring much comfort. Some think the liquid is a byproduct of the infection, something leaking from the earth as the land itself succumbs to whatever's reshaping it. Others believe it's a signal, a marker left by whoever or whatever is orchestrating all this. And then there are those who think it's alive, a sentient force testing the boundaries of its reach. I don't have answers, survivors, only observations. The black liquid isn't natural. It doesn't belong in this world, and every instinct I have tells me it's dangerous. If you see it, don't touch it. Don't even get close. Mark the area if you can, warn others, but keep your distance. There's something about it that feels like it's watching, waiting for the right moment to show us what it really is. One last thing. Survivors who've spent too much time near these pools have reported strange sensations afterward. A faint ringing in their ears, vivid dreams that feel more like memories, and a persistent sense of unease that doesn't fade no matter how far they go. If you've been near one and you're feeling any of this, don't ignore it. Pay attention to your surroundings, to the way the world shifts around you. These pools are a symptom of something bigger, something we can't afford to overlook. Stay sharp, survivors. The ground beneath our feet isn't as solid as it used to be, and the black liquid is proof of that. Keep moving, keep watching, and above all, keep your distance from what you can't explain. This world is testing us in ways we've never faced before, and it's up to us to learn fast or not at all. Survivors, let's talk about something that's been weighing heavily on my mind. The infected. We've spent so much time thinking of them as mindless creatures, driven only by the most basic instincts, that we've built entire survival strategies around the idea. But those strategies, they're starting to fall apart. The infected are changing, evolving, and the signs are becoming impossible to ignore. What I've seen over the past 2 weeks is something I can only describe as deliberate. These aren't the frenzied masses we've come to expect, the ones that throw themselves at anything loud or moving. No, these infected are different. They're slower, quieter, and far more dangerous. They move with purpose, as if guided by something we don't yet understand. It's not just about survival for them, it's about strategy. The first time I noticed it, I was moving through the remnants of a small suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where every house looks the same, even in ruin. I spotted a pair of infected crouched behind a toppled fence, their movements almost too human. At first, I thought they were just lingering, waiting for some sound or smell to draw them out. But as I watched, I realized they weren't lingering. They were hiding, their heads tilted ever so slightly, tracking a noise I hadn't even noticed yet. The faint shuffle of another survivor moving through the wreckage a block away. These infected weren't just reacting, they were stalking. And it's not just isolated incidents. I've seen it again and again since then. Infected moving in pairs or small groups, using the environment to their advantage. I watched one duck behind an overturned cart as another flanked its target from the opposite side. They weren't shambling mindlessly, they were hunting. It's a kind of coordination I've never seen before, and it's not just unsettling, it's terrifying. Noise traps, the kind we've all relied on for so long, are starting to lose their effectiveness. I've seen infected stop short of a clanging tin can, their heads tilting in that unnerving way they do when they're thinking or whatever it is they're doing now. They don't lunge blindly anymore. They assess. They avoid. Survivors, if you're still relying on distractions to buy yourself time, be prepared for the possibility that they won't work. The infected are learning, and that means we need to learn faster. I've also started noticing a pattern in the way they move. It's subtle, but once you see it, it's impossible to ignore. They're not clustering randomly anymore. They're forming lines, spirals, and other shapes that feel deliberate. I came across a group of them standing in a perfect semicircle around an old, crumbling statue in a city square. They weren't groaning or swaying. They were just standing there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. It's the kind of behavior that makes your stomach twist, that primal part of your brain screaming that whatever you're seeing isn't natural. And then there's the way they interact with us. Survivors have shared stories of infected mimicking their movements, crouching when they crouch, tilting their heads in the same direction, even raising their hands as if in some grotesque parody of humanity. One survivor described a particularly chilling encounter. She was hiding in an abandoned office building, watching an infected through a cracked window. She raised her hands slowly, testing a theory she couldn't fully articulate. The infected raised its hand too, in perfect sync. It didn't charge, didn't groan. It just stood there, mirroring her movements. She left before it could do anything else. What's most concerning, though, is how they seem to be drawn to certain places marked by the symbols we've been seeing more and more of. I've watched infected converge on areas where those spirals and angular designs are etched into the ground or burned into walls. They don't attack the symbols. They don't destroy them. They just gather, standing motionless as if paying some kind of homage. It raises questions I don't have answers to, questions I'm not sure I want to answer. There's something else I need to mention, something I witnessed that still keeps me awake at night. I saw a group of infected dismantle a barricade, not smash through it, dismantle it, piece by piece with a patience that felt entirely unnatural. They didn't rush, didn't seem agitated. They just worked, methodically pulling apart the debris until they had a clear path. It wasn't instinct, it was intention, and it makes me wonder, if they can do that now, what else are they capable of? Survivors, the infected we're dealing with today, aren't the same as the ones we faced a year ago, or even a month ago. They're adapting, evolving, becoming something we're not prepared for. And if we don't adapt with them, if we don't start thinking beyond the old strategies, we're going to find ourselves outmatched in ways we can't afford. So here's what I'll leave you with. Stay alert. Watch their movements. Learn from them just as they're learning from us. The infected are no longer a mindless threat. They're something far worse. And if we're not careful, they'll prove just how much worse they can be. Survivors, Let's turn our attention to something that doesn't seem as threatening at first glance but has been sending shivers, literally and figuratively, down my spine. I've been noticing an alarming pattern of sudden, unnatural frost zones appearing in areas where they have no business being. The world may be falling apart, but frost on the ground in the middle of a temperate night? That's not just strange, it's impossible. I first encountered one of these zones during a supply run through what used to be a rural stretch of farmland. The day had been unusually warm, almost stifling, and the air felt heavy in that way it does when a storm is about to break. But as I moved further into the area, the temperature dropped sharply. I don't mean a mild breeze or a bit of a chill. I mean the kind of cold that bites into your skin and makes your breath visible in the air. It happened so fast that I stopped in my tracks, looking around for any sign of an approaching storm. There was none, just the frost, creeping across the ground like an unwelcome tide. The frost wasn't normal either. It wasn't patchy or uneven like you'd expect from nature's randomness. It spread in strange, deliberate patterns, almost geometric in some places. Thin lines of ice etched into the dirt, crossing each other at angles too precise to be coincidental. It was as if the frost had a mind of its own, choosing where to grow and where to stop. And it wasn't just the ground. Plants caught in the frost's reach were coated in a brittle, crystalline layer that shimmered faintly, even in the dim light. It was beautiful in a way, but beauty has no place in survival. Beauty distracts you from the danger. As I moved carefully through the area, my boots crunching softly against the frozen earth, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. The air was too still, too quiet. No wind, no rustle of leaves, no sounds of wildlife. Just that silence, thick and oppressive, pressing down like a weight on my shoulders. It wasn't natural. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I kept moving, staying alert, and that's when I heard it. A faint hum, almost too low to notice. It wasn't coming from any direction in particular. It was everywhere, surrounding me, seeping into my bones. It wasn't a sound you heard. It was a sound you felt, vibrating through the air like the world itself was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And just as suddenly as the frost had appeared, the hum stopped, leaving me with that eerie silence once again. Since that encounter, I've been hearing more and more reports of frost zones cropping up in other places. Survivors have described waking up to find the ground around their camps frozen solid, despite the air still being warm enough to sleep without a fire. One group told me about finding an entire stretch of highway coated in ice, the vehicles abandoned there encased in a thin layer that sparkled like glass. They said the frost was so cold it burned when touched, leaving blisters on their hands that took days to heal. They didn't stay long enough to find out what had caused it, and I don't blame them. There's another strange detail that keeps coming up in these reports. The frost zones are often accompanied by other anomalies. Survivors have described seeing faint lights flickering just beyond their line of sight, dancing in and out of the darkness like fireflies. Others have mentioned the symbols we've talked about before: spirals, lines, and angular patterns, carved into the frost itself, as if the cold had somehow etched them into the land. And then there's the smell, sharp and metallic, like ozone after a lightning strike, clinging to the back of your throat and refusing to fade. The connection between these frost zones and the infected is still unclear, but there are signs that they're related. Survivors have reported seeing infected standing in the frost, completely motionless, their breath clouding the air as if they were alive. One group described a cluster of infected gathered in a frozen field, their heads tilted back as if staring at the sky. They didn't move, didn't react, even when the survivors made noise to test their response. It was as if they were in some kind of trance, drawn to the frost for reasons we can't begin to guess. So what's causing this? Is it tied to the infection, to the land itself, or to something we haven't even considered yet? I don't have answers, but I can tell you this. These frost zones aren't random. They're deliberate, calculated, and they're spreading. If you come across one, don't linger. The cold might seem harmless, but it's not. So warning, a sign that something is very, very wrong. Stay aware, survivors. The world is changing in ways we can't predict, and the frost is just one more piece of the puzzle. Keep moving, keep watching, and trust your instincts. In this world, hesitation is the same as surrender, and surrender is not an option. The frost may be cold, but the reality of this world is colder still. Survivors, let's talk about the one thing we all cling to out here, the idea of safety. It's fragile, fleeting, but it's what keeps us going. A safe place to rest, a few hours without looking over your shoulder. It's worth more than gold in this world. But what happens when even the illusion of safety is ripped away? I've been hearing reports, disturbing ones, about camps vanishing. Not raided, not overrun, just gone. It's a pattern I can't ignore, and neither should you. The first report came from a group of scavengers moving through a known safe zone about 10 miles from here. It was a place many of us have relied on, a cluster of buildings fortified months ago, with watchtowers, barriers, and enough supplies to keep a decent-sized group going for weeks. When the scavengers arrived, they found the gates open, the defenses intact, and the supplies untouched. But the people, gone. Every last one of them. No signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. This wasn't an isolated incident. Similar reports have been trickling in, each more unsettling than the last. Survivor camps, outposts, even small communities, all disappearing without a trace. The eerie part is how pristine these places are when they're found. Fires still burning low, food laid out as if someone had just stepped away for a moment, beds neatly made. It's as if whatever took these people wanted to leave everything else untouched. A haunting reminder of what was lost. I came across one of these camps myself. It was a roadside stop, a small cluster of RVs and makeshift shelters that had been there for months. I traded with the group a few times. Friendly enough people, cautious but fair. When I arrived, the place was silent. Not the kind of silence you get when a camp is abandoned or hiding. It was absolute. No rustling wind, no distant groans of infected, not even the chirp of insects, just stillness. I walked through the camp, calling out softly, half hoping someone would answer. No one did. The RV doors were open, the beds inside still warm. Pots of stew sat on portable stoves, the contents half-eaten. A deck of cards was laid out on a table mid-game. Everything felt frozen in time, as if the people there had been plucked out of existence in an instant. The only thing out of place was a single mark on the ground, a spiral carved into the dirt near the center of the camp. It wasn't there before. I know that much. Since then, I've been hearing more about these spirals, these symbols showing up at the sites of these disappearances. Survivors have described them burned into walls, etched into concrete, even drawn in ash on the ground. The designs aren't random. They're deliberate, intricate, and they seem to hum with a faint energy, one you can feel more than hear. Whatever they are, they're tied to the vanishings, of that I'm certain. And then there's the air in these places. Survivors who've stumbled upon these camps all describe the same thing. A heaviness, a pressure that makes it hard to breathe, like the atmosphere itself is rejecting you. Some have mentioned hearing faint whispers, just on the edge of perception, calling their names or saying things they can't quite make out. Others have described seeing shadows that don't belong, flickering at the edges of their vision. I felt it too in that RV camp. It's the kind of thing that makes your skin crawl, that primal part of your brain screaming at you to leave. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. These disappearances aren't confined to camps. Survivors have started reporting the same thing happening to smaller groups and even individuals. A convoy of vehicles found parked neatly on the side of the road, keys still in the ignition, every seat empty. A farmhouse where a family had been holding out, the table set for dinner, but no one home. It's as if the world is consuming people, erasing them one by one. There are theories, of course. Some say the infected have evolved to the point where they can move silently, strike without leaving a trace. Others think it's something else entirely, an entity or force beyond our understanding, tied to the symbols and the changes in the land. And then there are those who believe the disappearances are deliberate, orchestrated by survivors who've turned on their own. I don't know which is worse. What I do know is this: if a place feels too quiet, if the air feels heavy, if you see those symbols, don't stay. Mark it, warn others if you can. but keep moving. These places aren't safe. They're traps, even if we don't understand how or why. Whatever is causing these disappearances, it doesn't leave witnesses. And if you linger, you might become part of the next report. Stay sharp, survivors. The rules of this world are breaking down faster than we can keep up, and the only way to survive is to adapt. Remember, safety is an illusion, one that can shatter in an instant. Keep your eyes open, trust your instincts, and don't let your guard down. The moment you do, this world will remind you just how unforgiving it can be. Survivors, we've all grown used to the idea that the infected are the greatest threat, that the land beneath our feet, while treacherous, is still solid. But lately, there have been signs that even the earth is turning against us. Reports are coming in about something new, something that feels as alien as it does dangerous. It started with glowing patterns beneath the ground, veins of light that shouldn't be there, spreading like roots or cracks in glass. I've seen them myself, and they're not natural. They pulse, they hum, and they're connected to something far bigger than we understand. The first time I came across one of these glowing veins, I was making my way through a desolate industrial zone. The area was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you stop and listen for threats you can't see. I'd been there before, scavenging tools and supplies from the rusting skeletons of factories and warehouses. But this time, something was different. The air felt charged, like static before a lightning strike, and the faintest glow caught my eye near the edge of a collapsed wall. At first, I thought it was just sunlight filtering through debris, but as I moved closer, I realized the glow was coming from the ground itself. Thin lines of light, weaving in and out of the cracked concrete, forming a pattern too intricate to be random. The glow was a deep blue, almost like bioluminescence, but brighter, more deliberate. And it wasn't just light. It pulsed, as if something alive was coursing through those veins. I crouched down to get a better look, keeping my distance, and that's when I noticed the hum. It wasn't loud, more like a vibration you could feel in your chest. The longer I stayed, the stronger it got, almost like a warning, like the earth itself was telling me to leave. And then the pulsing quickened, just for a moment, as if it was responding to my presence. That was enough for me. I backed away and left the area, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those veins were watching me, or worse, that they were alive. Since then, I've been hearing similar stories from other survivors. One group described seeing the glowing veins while traveling through a canyon. They said the light wasn't just in the ground, it was in the walls of the canyon too, spreading upward like a network of roots. The air grew colder the closer they got, and one of them swore they saw the veins shift, like they were moving beneath the surface. They didn't stay long, but they all agreed on one thing. Whatever those veins are connected to, it's not something they wanted to find. There's a disturbing detail that keeps coming up in these accounts. Survivors have reported that the infected are drawn to these glowing veins, but not in the way you'd expect. They don't attack them or try to destroy them. Instead, they gather near the brightest points, standing perfectly still, their heads tilted as if listening to something we can't hear. It's not just unsettling, it's unnatural, and it raises questions I don't think any of us are ready to answer. The veins don't stay in one place either. Survivors have described them appearing and disappearing overnight, leaving no trace that they were ever there. One man told me about finding a cluster of glowing roots near an abandoned farm. He marked the area and returned the next day, only to find the ground untouched, the glow gone. The air, though, still felt heavy, charged, as if the veins were still there, just hidden beneath the surface. Some survivors have tried to get closer, to figure out what's causing these veins, but none of those stories end well. One woman described touching the edge of a glowing fissure with a metal tool, only to feel an electric jolt that knocked her flat. The tool, she said, was left blackened and warped, as if it had been burned from the inside out. Another group tried digging into the ground where the veins were brightest, but they stopped when the hum grew so loud it made their ears bleed. They filled the hole and left, convinced they'd narrowly avoided something far worse. There's also a growing connection between these veins and the symbols we've been seeing: spirals, angular patterns, and marks that defy explanation. Survivors have reported seeing the symbols etched into the ground around the veins, glowing faintly as if they were part of the same system. It's as if the land is speaking to us in a language we can't understand, or worse, a language we're not meant to understand. So what does it all mean? Are these veins part of the infection, a new stage in its evolution? Are they tied to the shifts we've seen in the land, the disappearing landmarks, the silent zones? Or are they something else entirely? Something older and far more dangerous than anything we've encountered before? I don't have answers, survivors, but I know one thing. These veins aren't just harmless anomalies. They're part of the larger pattern, the one that's reshaping our world in ways we're only beginning to grasp. If you come across one of these glowing veins, don't ignore it. Mark the area, take notes, but keep your distance. The land itself is no longer a passive backdrop to our survival. It's alive, and it's changing, just like everything else. The veins are a reminder that this world isn't just falling apart. It's rebuilding itself into something new, and we're caught in the middle of that transformation. Stay sharp, survivors. The ground beneath our feet is no longer the foundation we thought it was, and the glowing veins are proof of that. Keep moving, keep watching, and remember, the earth isn't as silent as it used to be. Listen closely, but don't linger too long. Whatever's pulsing beneath the surface, it's not waiting for us to understand it. Survivors, there's something new stirring out there, something that's bending the boundaries of what we thought was real. I'm calling them mirage zones, and if you've encountered one, you'll know exactly what I mean. They're places where the world doesn't behave like it should, where the air ripples like heat waves on a summer road, where solid objects seem to shimmer and fade, and where the landscape shifts in ways that defy logic. These zones aren't natural, and they're spreading. The first time I stumbled into one, it caught me completely off guard. I was crossing a stretch of open land, the kind of place that should have been simple to navigate. The day was clear, the air calm, and there were no obvious signs of danger. But as I moved further in, the horizon started to blur. It wasn't like fog or smoke. This was different. The edges of the landscape seemed to ripple and twist, as if the world itself was melting. I stopped, thinking maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but the longer I looked, the worse it got. Trees that had been upright moments ago began to lean, their branches stretching unnaturally. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse, almost like it was breathing. At first, I thought it might be exhaustion or dehydration. I've been in this line of survival long enough to know how the body can betray you. But this wasn't internal. It was external, affecting everything around me. As I moved, the ripples followed, and the landscape shifted. A path I'd been following for miles looped back on itself, leading me to a spot I swore I'd already passed. Landmarks that should have been visible. An old silo, a twisted oak tree, seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like mirages on the edge of a desert. And then came the noises, not loud, not even clear, but present. A faint clicking, like the sound of glass tapping against metal, carried on a breeze that didn't seem to exist. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding me, filling the space between the ripples. I've learned to trust my instincts, and every one of them screamed at me to get out of there. So I turned back the way I came, or at least I thought I did. That's the thing about these zones. They mess with your sense of direction, your perception of time and space. It's like being caught in a labyrinth that shifts every time you take a step. By the time I made it out, hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. The air felt normal again, the landscape solid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the zone had followed me, that it had marked me in some way. Since then, I've been hearing similar stories from other survivors. One group described finding themselves in a mirage zone while scavenging the outskirts of a ruined town. They said the buildings seemed to stretch and contract, their walls bending at impossible angles. A street they'd walked down moments before vanished entirely, replaced by an open field. One of them swore they saw their own reflection in a window that shouldn't have been there, staring back at them with a face that wasn't quite their own. They left the zone as quickly as they could, but not before one of them collapsed, clutching their head and screaming about shapes moving in the air. And it's not just visual distortions. Survivors have reported feeling physical effects in these zones: nausea, dizziness, even shortness of breath. One man told me about walking through a zone where the air felt thick, almost liquid, making every step a struggle. He said it was like moving through molasses, each breath heavy and labored. Another described feeling a sudden, intense heat followed by a bone-chilling cold, as if the zone couldn't decide what season it was. What's most disturbing, though, are the disappearances. Survivors have gone into these zones and never come out. Entire groups, well-armed and experienced, have vanished without a trace. Those who've returned have spoken of shadowy figures moving at the edges of the distortions, watching but never approaching. Some claim to have seen lights, bright, pulsing, and hypnotic, hovering just out of reach, leading them deeper into the zone before abruptly disappearing. Whether these are tricks of the light or something more sinister, I can't say, but the fact remains. The zones are dangerous, and they're growing. There's a theory that these mirage zones are tied to the symbols we've been seeing, the ones etched into the land and glowing faintly in the dark. Survivors have reported finding these markings at the heart of the zones, carved into rocks or burned into the ground. They seem to pulse in sync with the distortions, as if they're the source of the zone's power. Others believe the zones are linked to the infection, that they're areas where the virus has seeped into the land itself, warping reality in its wake. Whatever the cause, one thing is clear: these zones are not natural. They're deliberate, calculated, and they're spreading faster than we can keep track of. If you see the telltale ripples, if the air starts to shimmer or the landscape begins to shift, turn back. Mark the area if you can, but don't linger. These zones aren't just dangerous, they're predatory, and they don't let go easily. Survivors, we're facing a world that's becoming less familiar with every passing day. The ground beneath us, the air around us, even the fabric of reality itself. It's all breaking down, reshaping into something new. Stay vigilant, stay sharp, and above all, stay out of the zones. They're not just places, they're warnings, and we'd be wise to heed them. Survivors, let's focus on something that's been creeping its way into more and more reports: the symbols. These aren't random scrawls or graffiti left behind by survivors marking territory. No, these are deliberate, intricate, and unnervingly precise. They're appearing everywhere now, etched into stone, carved into wood, burned into the earth. They've become impossible to ignore, and the more we see them, the harder it is to shake the feeling that they're connected to everything else unraveling around us. The first time I encountered one of these symbols was weeks ago, on a stretch of cracked asphalt that used to be a well-traveled road. The symbol was massive, spanning the width of the pavement. It was a spiral, but not the kind you'd find in nature. This one was sharp, angular, its edges too clean to be the result of erosion or chance. It wasn't just carved into the surface, it was burned. The asphalt blackened and cracked around the edges, as if some intense heat had seared it into place. Standing over it, I felt something I can only describe as a pull, a faint pressure in the air that seemed to tug at my chest. The longer I stared, the more the spiral seemed to shift, the lines twisting and coiling in ways that didn't make sense. I left quickly, but the image stayed with me, burned into my memory as vividly as it was burned into the road. Since then, the symbols have been showing up everywhere. Survivors have reported finding them in the most unlikely places. Deep in the woods where no one should have been, on the walls of crumbling buildings, even on the shells of abandoned vehicles. Some have described them as glowing faintly at night, pulsing in a rhythm that feels almost alive. One group told me about a symbol they found etched into the side of an old water tower. They said it seemed to hum when they got close, a low, vibrating sound that made their teeth ache. They didn't stay long enough to figure out what it meant. The patterns themselves vary, but there are commonalities: spirals, interlocking triangles, jagged lines that intersect at impossible angles. They're too precise, too deliberate to be the work of random chance or human hands. Some survivors have tried to map them, to find a pattern or meaning in their placement, but so far, no one's been able to make sense of it. The only thing that's clear is that these symbols are spreading, appearing in more places and with greater frequency. There's another layer to this that makes it even more unsettling. survivors have started noticing that the symbols often appear near other anomalies, silent zones, glowing veins, and areas where the infected behave in strange, coordinated ways. It's as if the symbols are tied to these phenomena, marking the places where reality itself is bending. One woman described finding a spiral carved into the ground at the center of a frost zone. She said the air around it felt heavier, colder, and that the frost seemed to grow thicker the closer she got. She left before she could find out what would happen if she stayed. The infected seemed drawn to these symbols as well. Survivors have reported seeing clusters of infected gathered around them, standing perfectly still, their heads tilted back as if in reverence. They don't attack, don't groan or move, they just stand there motionless, as if the symbol is holding them in place. It's not just unsettling, it's wrong, a clear sign that these marks are more than they appear. Then there are the whispers. Survivors who've spent too much time near the symbols have described hearing faint voices, just on the edge of perception. Some say the whispers speak their names, others describe them as fragmented, broken phrases in a language they can't understand. One man told me about standing near a spiral etched into a concrete wall, the whispers growing louder the longer he stayed. He swore he heard a single word, clear as day: run. He did. What's most disturbing is how these symbols seem to interact with the environment. Survivors have reported seeing plants growing in strange patterns around them, spiraling upward or twisting unnaturally. The ground near the symbols often feels different, softer, spongier, or vibrating faintly underfoot. In some cases, the symbols appear to be the source of glowing residue, the same kind we've seen spreading in other areas. It's as if the land itself is reacting to these marks, reshaping around them. There are theories, of course. Some believe the symbols are part of the infection, a way for it to spread beyond the living and into the land itself. Others think they're warnings, left behind by survivors or some other force trying to guide us. And then there are those who think the symbols are summoning something, calling to a presence we don't understand and can't control. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain: these symbols aren't random. They're deliberate, and they're connected to the changes happening all around us. If you come across one of these symbols, be cautious. Mark its location if you can, but don't linger. The more time you spend near them, the more they seem to notice you. These aren't just marks on the ground or walls. They're part of something much bigger, something that's reshaping the world in ways we can't yet comprehend. Stay sharp, survivors. The symbols are speaking, and while we may not understand the language, we can't afford to ignore the message. Survivors, let's talk about the figures that have been appearing at the edges of our world. They don't move like the infected, they don't attack, and they don't follow the patterns of survivors. Instead, they stand still, watching. I've been calling them the observers, and I'm not the only one who's seen them. Reports are growing, and each one is more unsettling than the last. The first time I saw one was during an early morning trek through an overgrown industrial park. The mist was thick, clinging to the ground and blurring the shapes of the abandoned buildings around me. I was alone, keeping my steps quiet as I moved through the wreckage, when I noticed a shadow in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fog, maybe a piece of debris catching the light at an odd angle. But as I got closer, it became clear that it was neither. It was a figure, human-shaped but wrong somehow. The proportions didn't feel right, too tall, too thin, and the edges of its silhouette seemed to waver, like it wasn't fully there. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, facing me, though I couldn't make out any features. My instincts told me to turn back, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. So I did, but when I glanced over my shoulder moments later, it was gone. The space it had occupied was empty, the mist swirling as if something had disturbed it. Since then, I've been hearing more about these observers. Survivors describe seeing them in similar conditions, on misty mornings, at twilight, or in the shadows of crumbling structures. They're always just far enough away to make you doubt your own eyes, but close enough to send a chill down your spine. They don't approach, don't interact, but their presence is impossible to ignore. It's as if they're studying us, cataloging our movements, our behaviors, our vulnerabilities. One group of survivors reported seeing an observer while traveling through a stretch of dense forest. They described it as motionless, standing among the trees with its head tilted slightly to one side. The group tried to move past it without drawing attention, but as they did, one of them swore they saw the figure turn to watch them, its head snapping to follow their movement. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. There's something about the way these figures make you feel, too, an unnatural weight, a sense of being watched that doesn't leave you, even after you've put miles between yourself and where you saw them. Survivors have described the sensation as oppressive, like a pair of unseen eyes pressing against their backs. Some have even reported hearing faint whispers, though the words are never clear, just a low murmur that rises and falls like distant wind. Then there are the lights. Survivors who've encountered observers often describe seeing faint, flickering lights nearby, blue, white, or red, glowing softly in the fog or shadows. The lights don't move like flashlights or torches. They drift, almost like they're alive, pulsing faintly as they hover just out of reach. One man described following a light he saw near an old water tower, thinking it might be a signal from another survivor. But as he got closer, he noticed an observer standing beneath it, perfectly still. He turned and ran before either the light or the figure could do anything more. There's a growing theory that these observers are tied to the symbols we've been seeing, the spirals and angular marks etched into the land. Survivors have reported seeing observers standing near these symbols, as if guarding them or drawn to them. One group described finding a spiral burned into the ground, with an observer standing at its center. They watched from a distance as the figure remained motionless, even as the spiral seemed to pulse faintly with light. When they finally moved closer, the observer was gone, leaving only the symbol behind. What's most unsettling is that the observers don't seem to follow the rules of the infected, or of anything else we've encountered so far. They don't react to noise or light, don't attack, and don't move in any way that makes sense. Survivors have described seeing them vanish in the blink of an eye, only to reappear farther away or closer without any explanation. One woman told me about seeing an observer reflected in a shattered window pane, though when she turned around, the space behind her was empty. What are they? Are they some new stage of the infection, a manifestation of whatever force is reshaping the world? Are they remnants of those who've disappeared, caught between this world and whatever lies beyond? Or are they something entirely different, something older, watching and waiting as the world crumbles around us? I don't have answers, survivors. All I know is that these figures are appearing more frequently, and they're tied to the same changes we've been seeing everywhere else. If you see one, don't approach. Don't try to understand it. Just move on. These observers aren't here to help us, and the longer you stay in their presence, the more you'll feel it. The weight, the whispers, the undeniable sense that you're being watched by something far beyond your understanding. Stay vigilant, survivors. The world is unraveling, and the observers are just another thread in this tangled mess. They're watching, and while we may not know why, it's clear that whatever they're waiting for, it won't be good for us. Keep your eyes open, but don't linger too long. Some things are better left in the shadows. Survivors, we need to talk about the air. Not the storms, not the shifts in temperature or the eerie stillness that comes with the quiet zones. This is something else, something I've heard described in more and more reports. The air itself, alive and aware, carrying whispers, murmurs, and voices that shouldn't be there. Subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss. But once you notice it, it's impossible to ignore. The first time I noticed it was during a night spent sheltered in the remains of an old church. The building was falling apart, most of the roof gone, but it offered enough cover to keep me hidden. As the hours dragged on, I started to feel it, that strange, pressing weight in the air. It wasn't wind, there was no storm coming, but the air felt charged, like the moments before lightning strikes. And then I heard it, a faint murmur, so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves. I thought it might have been the sound of the church settling, or maybe an animal moving nearby. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't random noise, it was voices, dozens of them, overlapping, whispering fragments of sentences that made no sense. They weren't close, but they weren't distant either. They seemed to be everywhere, surrounding me, filling the cracks in the air. I couldn't make out any specific words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, almost pleading. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. The voices didn't stop, didn't fade, though they never grew louder either. When dawn broke, they were gone, leaving the air still and silent as if they'd never been there. But I knew what I'd heard, and I've heard it again since then, in different places under different conditions. It's not confined to one area or one time of day. The air itself seems to carry it, moving it wherever it chooses. Reports from other survivors confirm I'm not alone in this. A group traveling through the ruins of a small town described hearing whispers while navigating an old grocery store. They said the voices seemed to follow them, growing clearer the deeper they went into the building. One of them swore they heard their own name spoken, soft but unmistakable. They left without finding any supplies, too unnerved to stay. Another survivor shared a similar experience near a riverbank. He described sitting by the water, trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace, when the air grew heavy. He said it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the atmosphere, leaving him gasping for breath. And then the whispers began, soft at first, almost melodic, but growing sharper, angrier. He left as quickly as he could, but even hours later, he swore he could still feel the weight of the air pressing against his chest. What's even more unsettling is that the voices don't always stay in the background. Some survivors have reported them growing louder, clearer, even speaking directly to them. One woman described hearing a voice say, "Don't stop," as she climbed through a window to escape a group of infected. She didn't question it at the time, but later, she couldn't shake the feeling that the voice wasn't hers. It didn't belong to her thoughts. Another man, traveling alone, said he heard a voice whisper, "This isn't yours," as he approached an abandoned farmhouse. He left without investigating further, unsure if it was a warning or a threat. And it's not just voices. The air itself seems to shift around these phenomena, growing colder or warmer, denser or thinner. Survivors have described feeling like they were walking through water, their movements sluggish and heavy, while the voices grew louder. Others have reported sudden gusts of wind, sharp and biting, that carried faint, unintelligible words with them. One group traveling through a forest said the air became so thick with whispers that it felt like they were being surrounded by an invisible crowd, their own voices drowned out by the noise. Theories about what's causing this are as varied as the reports themselves. Some think it's tied to the infection, a side effect of whatever is reshaping the world around us. Others believe it's connected to the glowing veins and symbols we've been seeing, that the voices are part of the same force twisting the land into something unrecognizable. And then there are those who think the voices are remnants of the past, echoes of people and places lost in the chaos, imprinted on the air itself. Whatever the truth is, it's clear that the air isn't just air anymore. It's carrying more than wind and weather. It's carrying something alive, something aware. If you hear the whispers, don't ignore them. Pay attention to how the air feels, to the way it shifts and presses against you. These voices, whatever they are, aren't random. They're deliberate, and they're speaking to us, even if we can't understand their words. Survivors, the world is changing in ways we can't predict, and the air is part of that change. Stay alert, and don't let the whispers lead you astray. They might be warnings, they might be messages, or they might be something far more dangerous. Whatever they are, they're part of the same tangled web that's drawing us deeper into this new reality. Stay sharp, and trust your instincts. The air carries more than just sound now, and it's up to us to decide what we do with it. Survivors, as this broadcast comes to a close, I want to bring everything we've talked about into focus. All these pieces, the symbols, the infected behavior, the mirage zones, the whispers in the air, they're not isolated events. They're threads in a larger, tangled web, and the more we pull at them, the more they connect. It's a pattern that feels deliberate, purposeful, as though some unseen force is stitching the fabric of this broken world into something new. The question we're left with is, to what end? Let's start with what we know. The infected are evolving. They're moving strategically, clustering around symbols, and sometimes showing behaviors that mimic our own. It's not mindless hunger anymore, it's intent. Whether it's coordination, communication, or something even more complex, the rules we once relied on are breaking down. These aren't just monsters to be avoided. They're becoming something that might think, plan, and adapt. And they're tied to the places where the land itself is changing. The symbols are everywhere now, carved into walls, etched into the ground, burned into the remnants of the old world. Spirals, interlocking lines, shapes that defy logic, they're markers or messages or something we haven't yet understood. Survivors have found infected clustered around them, the land reshaping itself in their presence, and whispers in the air growing louder when they're nearby. These symbols aren't random. They're a deliberate part of a larger force we can't yet define. Then there's the air. It carries whispers, voices that seem to speak directly to us, pressing against us with a weight that feels almost alive. Survivors have described it as oppressive, charged, and aware. It shifts and changes, growing heavier or lighter, colder or warmer, depending on where you are and what's around you. And in some places, it seems to carry more than voices, echoes of the past, glimpses of the future, or perhaps something else entirely. It's as though the air itself has become a conduit for whatever force is reshaping the world. The land is no longer a constant. Roads twist into loops, landmarks vanish or reappear in different forms, and new features, canyons, cliffs, forests, seem to spring up overnight. The mirage zones are the most unsettling of all, places where reality bends and shifts, where time and space no longer behave as they should. Survivors have gone into these zones and come out changed, disoriented, or not at all. And at the heart of many of these zones, you'll find the same patterns. The symbols, the whispers, the infected standing in eerie silence. The observers add another layer to this puzzle. These figures, always on the edge of sight, watching but never engaging, seem to appear where the anomalies are strongest. Survivors who've encountered them describe an overwhelming sense of being studied, cataloged, or judged. They don't attack, don't communicate, but their presence is impossible to ignore. They feel like witnesses, or perhaps sentinels, watching as the world continues to unravel. And then there are the lights, flickering, pulsing, always just out of reach. Survivors have followed them, hoping for safety, only to find danger or emptiness. Some believe the lights are guiding us, while others think they're lures, traps set by forces we don't understand. Whatever they are, they're tied to the same changes, the same threads, leading us deeper into the unknown. The connections between all of this are undeniable. The infected, the symbols, the shifting land, the air, the observers, the lights, they're all part of the same tangled web. And yet, the purpose behind it remains unclear. Is it the infection spreading beyond the living, reshaping the world in its image? Is it the earth itself reacting to the chaos, adapting in ways we can't comprehend? Or is it something else entirely, something older and far more deliberate? Survivors, I won't pretend to have the answers. All I can do is share what I've seen, what I've heard, and what I've pieced together. This world is changing, faster than we can keep up, and it's up to us to adapt. Pay attention to the patterns, trust your instincts, and don't dismiss the signs around you. The threads may be tangled, but they're all connected, and if we can follow them to their source, we might find the truth, or at least a way to survive. For now, keep moving, keep observing, and keep sharing what you find. Every piece of information, every detail, brings us closer to understanding what's happening. Together, we're stronger than whatever force is trying to reshape this world. Stay sharp, survivors, and remember, the story isn't over yet. The threads are still unraveling, and we're still here to pull at them.